right, hey everybody, good morning. Welcome back. Hope you guys are doing really good. Had a great weekend. This is Monday, April 27th, and we're taking care of our Intro to Philosophy lecture this AM from 10 to 10:50. So for all of you showing up and watching, you're doing really well. And we have another important key meeting as we try and get through more notes on this philosophy of mind subject. So thanks for being here. And we got a couple minutes till class time, so then we'll get right into it. Hey, Brian, how are you? And for all of you guys watching, just as usual, feel free to chat, say hello, ask any questions, comments. It's all good, whatever interaction you can get into. It's just a good thing. So thank you. Hey, Kaylee. Hi. Nice to see you. Good morning. Awesome. Yes. My cat is just off stage here, just below the camera. So if you see me kind of looking around, it's because of her. Hey, Andy, nice to see you. Okay. Just another minute or so, and then we'll see how long that takes. And depending on if we get to the full class time when we're done or not, then we'll start to roll into the following author in the sequence after that, which is J.J.C. Smart. But we still have a little bit left over from Daniel Stoljar's paper, so I'm going to go back to it for a moment. And as everybody knows, in about, 2 weeks, yes, your essay will be due, so don't forget to just be mindful of the prompts and the due date and so on. And then the study guide, I'm going to distribute that next week for the upcoming final exam, so not to worry about it yet, but you'll get it in the following week so that you'll have about 2 weeks to work with it. Our final exam is on the 19th, so there will be plenty of time for us to all get the review sessions in, and hey Jessica, and to be as fully prepared as we can all be for that test. So anyways, upcoming study guide will be distributed next week, and then for now, let's just keep taking our good notes, attending as well as we can, and preparing for your second papers. Okay, so quick little refresher on the past few meetings and this topic that we're dealing with. We're now in the world of philosophy of mind, where questions are all about consciousness. What's the basis of it? What's the nature of consciousness? So when we talk about consciousness, we mean like, the mental life that you have, feelings, thoughts, perceptions, experiences, emotions, the subjective point of view that you have got as an individual conscious being. What's the nature of that? Is that something that is just physical? Is it just the brain? Or is there something about consciousness and thought that is not physical, that cannot be explained physically? So a couple of major positions, debated positions in the philosophy of mind, are about the difference between monism and dualism. Okay, so some people hold the view called monism. That view says that everything in the universe is made out of just one kind of substance. On the other side, there's what is called dualism, which says that everything in this universe is made out of two different kinds of substances. So there's these two different views, monism versus dualism. Now, what are these substances that are being discussed on both theories? First of all, one of them is physical matter. So physical matter is just anything that's extended in space, anything that occupies space, that takes up some volume, that has some mass, even if it's a very small amount, something that's extended in space. The other possible substance is called mind, and the way that that's thought of in philosophy is something that's not got any material extension in space. So no extension in space, not just really, really small, but literally no size, shape, mass, or volume at all. It's not a material object, but it's thinking. It's got consciousness. So that's kind of like the idea of a soul or spirit but in philosophy the term is used mind. So monism can divide down into two possible kinds of monism. There are physicalist monists, which is the one that we're mostly looking at in comparison with dualism. But physicalists are those who say everything in the universe is just made out of matter. All things are made out of matter, even me and you, even our consciousness. So if you were a physicalist type monist, then you would say that consciousness, thought, perception, and so forth is really just brain activity, and it's a physical process then being carried out by the brain. There's the other monism called idealism, which holds that there's no matter and everything is just thoughts. But that's not as taken as seriously, I don't think, today. So we're mostly concerned with the physicalist brand of monism contrasted with dualism. Now, dualists say there's both. There's mind and there's matter. Maybe most things are made out of just physical matter, objects and everything that you see around you, even your body. But according to the dualist, where there's consciousness, there's a mind that doesn't have any material extension, and it's something that is distinct from the body. And so we looked at one argument for dualism over the past few meetings, very long and detailed argument from René Descartes. His basic argument was basically, just make a long story short, because we've gone over it a couple times, but basically the point was, you exist because you're thinking. Even if maybe you didn't have a body, you're a thinking thing because you're thinking. So you exist, you have a mind. In that mind, there are different ideas, but one of them is God, the idea of God. And that idea is just so great that there really must be a God to even give you the idea, because nothing else could have caused the idea of something infinite except for something which is infinite. So there must be a God. Then it says, well, he's known as perfectly good, so he's not a deceiver. So if you have a clear and distinct perception, then that has to be true, because God wouldn't want you to be deceived about things that are very clear. One thing that is very clear is that if you can imagine two things existing separately from each other, then they must be capable of actually being separated, and therefore they are two separate things. And so since we can imagine our mind and body existing separately, as considered by the method of doubt, then they must really be capable of existing separately, and therefore they're two different things. Okay, that's the really short version of Descartes' argument based on conceivability, that it's clearly conceivable of the mind and body to exist separately. And when God, the perfect God, is so good, he wouldn't want something that's that clearly conceivable to not be real. Okay, now we're on to the other side of this debate, which is the physicalist position. And the author that we're reviewing for the moment is this man named Daniel Stoljar. His paper from 2005, just called Physicalism. Okay, so here's how far we got with him. We started off mentioning just that he defines the term physicalism as the view that everything is physical. Everything in the universe is physical, not just some things, not just most things, but 100% of all things are physical things. There is not one thing that is not physical. And that means that even your mind and your consciousness and thought and everything is just physical. As he puts it, although there are other subjects that people study and that they are interested in that don't immediately appear to have anything to do with physics, like history or sociology or art or whatever, that all of those things are still just indirectly branches of physics, because no matter what it is that's going on in the universe, it's the playing out of a physical process governed by the natural laws. So a historical period that historians may study is just the acting out of life forms on the surface of the earth, which are ultimately constituted by physical material operating according to natural and biological laws of nature. What is, a piece of music or an artwork other than a production generated by a confluence of physical forces and materials in the universe? So physicalism claims everything's physical, even things that are not immediately appearing to be having to do anything with the physical. Okay, so then he says, if you want to be a little more in-depth and understanding of the view, there are two questions that you should try to answer, or at least contend with. So these two questions, he said, were on the one hand the interpretation question, and on the other hand the truth question. So the interpretation question poses this question: what does it mean to say that everything is physical? So, what is the view of physicalism really saying? How do we interpret it? It says everything's physical, but what does that really mean? Okay, so that's one question that he says we have to deal with. And the other one is the truth question, which asks, is it true that everything is physical? Okay, now we were opening up his answer to the interpretation question, which he presents through the concept of supervenience, all right? So supervenience is where we pretty much left off last time. There's the word, the concept, supervenience. So he says, for you to kind of be able to answer this question, what does it mean to say that everything is physical? You have to consider the concept of supervenience, which gives the answer. So supervenience is all about a relationship of little things building up larger composite structures. The classic example to explain the concept of supervenience is the example of a dot matrix image or picture. So last time I tried to draw you guys a very crude depiction of, let's say, a dot matrix image, and it was something that looked like this. Okay, so I'm attempting to draw an image of like a nice sunny day at the beach. So these are waves, ocean waves. This is the sun shining down, a couple of seagulls or whatever they are, birds flying through the air above the water. Now, in a real dot matrix picture, okay, you have a picture which is ultimately made out of a bunch of tiny little dots of ink placed on a grid in a certain pattern. This is the method by which it is easily reproduced images on the printed page. You basically have a set grid with a coordinated set of instructions about which points along the grid are to be illuminated by which colored dots. That is stamped on the grid, thus generating the image, and on in the assembly line as we reproduce images of exactly the same kind. So there's a grid, and on the grid, there are individual dots of ink which form the larger picture. Other analogies which give a similar type of concept, there's also, for example, digital screens like what you're watching this on, which are also built out of tiny bits that combine to form the larger image. But in this case, they're pixels rather than dots of ink, of course. So how is it that you're even able to watch me or to share photos or memes with other people and see the same thing displayed on other devices? Because instructions are given to the display on your screen for the pixels that form the grid of the resolution of the viewing device to illuminate in a certain pattern, thus displaying the visual image to you. Okay, so whether considered through the example of a dot matrix image on printed page or a pixelated image on the digital screen or monitor, hopefully the picture or idea is clear. There can be a large image built out of fundamental elements, atomic elements, which could be in one case ink dots or in another case pixels. All right, we introduced some terminology. Global feature. What's a global feature again? A global feature is a large-scale aspect of such a composite like this. So, for example, what would be one global feature of the image that you see there? Maybe I asked this question last time. If so, sorry for the repetition, but let's just kind of quickly say, what, for example, would be a global feature of this image? Yeah, okay, good, William, the sun. So let's be clear, what's a global feature? The term just refers to something that is formed by the individual elements when they combine together. Good. Birds, waves, exactly. So those are like large-scale aspects of this arbitrarily described or constructed dot matrix image. Now, to understand supervenience, here's what we want to think about. That if we had got a second dot matrix image, which was an identical arrangement of dots with the same dot-for-dot pattern, then the second dot-for-dot duplicate would have to have all the same global features as the first image did. So basically, if we had a carbon copy of this to the right, where every single dot is perfectly reproduced in the same arrangement and order as seen here, then yes, that second image would still have all the same global features. It would still contain a representation of the birds flying, the sun, and the waves. So if we contain two images or structures which are composites, but they have the exact same ordering of atomic elements, then they have to have the same global features. And likewise, if two images differed in a global feature somewhere, then they must also differ in the underlying distribution of dots that form the two composites. So when we compare two different grids like these, if the two grids had the same atomic array in terms of order and arrangement, then they would have to have the same global features. And if they differed at the top level, at the global feature level, then they must also differ at the base level. So sameness of the atomic elements equals sameness of all global features. But in two cases where there are different global features, like say we had a different composite over here, which was just like this, except one of the birds was missing. If a global feature was different in the second case, then it also cannot possibly, by definition, have the same exact pattern of dots. Okay, now, this is supposed to carry over as an analogy to the physical universe, okay? So what's being stated next is that just as with these dot matrix pictures with the features just mentioned, our universe is very much similar to that. So what do you think would be the thing that plays the role of the pixels or ink dots in physical space? So in actual reality now, not in just these given examples. If you were to think about the world as kind of being somewhat of a mirror of a dot matrix construction, then what would be the stand-in for the dots in actual physical reality? Okay, good, Jessica, atoms, exactly. So atomic elements of physical reality could be seen as serving a role similar to these individual bits of ink, because they combine to form all the larger things that we see and interact with every day, and even us ourselves, according to physicalism. So now I want you guys to, if you can, supply me with an example or a few, perhaps, of what could be considered a global feature of actual physical reality. Okay, so like, you know, you gave me the right kind of answer before when I used this example. I said, what's a global feature of this? People said the sun, the waves, the birds. Good. So now as we carry this analogy or metaphor over to physical reality, what do you think, since the atoms are like the dots, what could be, there's infinite examples to choose from, clearly, so it's not like there's only one right answer, but what, for example, could be considered a global feature of this reality? Okay, so you're saying clouds, good. Statue of Liberty, a car. I like all those examples, and they're very good examples, so that's exactly right. Let's say, for example, Statue of Liberty, because it's a public object instead of a category of objects, but all those things are fair, and humans as well, yes, or a dog. So I like the multiplicity of different examples. They're all fair and correct, but let me just refer to one, the Statue of Liberty, for example. It's a big object. It's over there in Ellis Island in New York, you know, greeting incoming immigrants to the United States with the classic message etched in there. Bring us your poor, your downtrodden something. I forget the exact words, but it's an inspirational piece of writing, right? It's a poem. But back to the question of what this serves in the example, it's a global feature of reality. Why? Because it's something that's made out of a bunch of physical atoms. So it's not one of the atoms, clearly, but something that is the aggregation of many of them. And it doesn't end with an example of Statue of Liberty, clearly. So all the other examples you've mentioned are also good. A car, something that you drive around in and transport yourself in, is made out of physical material. So it's made out of atoms too. And even you yourself, as you're saying there, Caesar, is a global feature of reality. According to physicalism anyway, you, as much as anything else, are just a composite of a bunch of little atoms arranged in a particular order to form the life form that you happen to be. Okay, now, since we are saying that the atoms are the equivalent of these dots, and the global features of reality are the equivalent of, things formed by the dots, as, for example, any macroscopic object that's made out of material. The claim is this. Now, remember the thing about comparing two possible composites. If there were a second physical universe, okay, talking about one separate from this one, if there was a second physical universe which had the exact same pattern of atoms in it and was arranged atomically identical to ours. So I'm talking about if there was an atom for atom duplicate of this physical universe, then what would that universe be like according to the concept of supervenience? Since everything supervenes on atoms, everything is, in other words, made out of the atoms and the pattern that they are arranged in. Question: if there were a second universe which was atomically exactly like this one, then what would that universe be like in general when compared to ours? Well, it would be physical, yes, but I'm asking this sort of different question. Suppose that another universe was a physical copy of ours, meaning that all the atoms in that universe were positioned the same way they are here. Then that other universe, exactly William and Jessica, it would be the same as our own. It would be an identical duplicate. It would have the same global features. So would the coronavirus outbreak have happened in this hypothetical second universe, which is atomically a copy of ours? Yes. Would there have been the election of Barack Obama or President Trump, or would World War II have happened? Would Abraham Lincoln have been assassinated? Yes. Would there be a duplicate of you in this copy universe, which is atomically structured just like ours? Yes. There'd be a copy of you having a lecture like this and thinking the same thoughts as you are thinking now. Because according to supervenience, when two structures are identical at the atomic base level, then they are going to be exactly identical also at every global level of a higher description. So the atomic facts being exactly the same holds fixed all the global features. And that's what the idea of supervenience is saying here. So if there are two physical systems with the same elements, they'd have the same global features. Let me write then a formal definition of physicalism that's based on this concept of supervenience now that we've fully expressed the analogy of the dot matrix. So now Daniel Stoljar, having presented this analogy between the physical universe and how it's made out of atoms and dot matrix images, which are made out of dots, we can express and define physicalism clearly, he thinks. And it means this: physicalism. Physicalism is true at a possible world W just in case any world which is an atomic duplicate of W is a duplicate of W in all respects. Okay, so what is being said here is that if physicalism is true in our universe, which is just labeled as the possible world W, if physicalism is true in this universe, what that means is if there were a second physical universe, which was atomically exactly like ours, then it would have all the same global features as well, including the same historical events, episodes, objects, people, and even consciousness. So what supervenience physicalism denies is the possibility that if things were physically the same, that there somehow could be a difference mentally. So it's not as if in this second physically identical universe to ours, that the copy of you could be thinking different thoughts, because your thought content and your mental life is itself just the outcome of all the atoms grouped up forming you and your brain. So it's not as if consciousness is somehow escaping from the structure of the physical. If there were a physical universe which was the same at the level of atoms as ours, then it would have the same exact conscious experiences, events, historical episodes, and all of that. So that's the idea of physicalism explained by means of the idea of supervenience. The question of the interpretation question was, what does it mean to say that everything's physical? And he says, now you basically have your answer. What it means to say that everything is physical is to say that everything supervenes on atoms. Simply stated, everything's ultimately built out of atoms, even you, me, our consciousness, and everything else besides that. It is so much so built out of atoms, physical atoms, that if there were, by hypothesis, a second physical universe with the same atomic facts and structure, then it would be a perfect duplicate of ours in every way. So consciousness thus is nothing other than the result that is generated from an aggregation of physical atoms. And that's, I guess, according to physicalism, what we are. We're very complex physical objects that exhibit consciousness, but this consciousness that we take to be so rare, unique, special, distinctive is simply another brain process. And again, if another universe were the same as ours at the level of atomic facts, then it would have to have the same consciousnesses as well. So that, he believes, answers our interpretation question. And he says you really have to think about and understand supervenience for you to understand the position of physicalism. So he says this is a basic commitment that physicalists make, that the concept of supervenience is true, that everything is built out of atoms. Thus, again, a second universe with the same physical facts would have the same larger scale facts at every level of description. The greatest opposition to this claim of physicalism comes from the idea of consciousness, right? So aside from consciousness, there's really nothing in the universe that strikes you as having to not have a physical explanation, right? Explaining everything in terms of its material constitution built out of physical atoms, I don't think that that seems to be so counterintuitive or weird to anybody until you start thinking about consciousness and thought. Like, so I'm basically saying tables and chairs, this whiteboard, no one looks at them and says, isn't there something spooky and like spiritual or supernatural going on? Because nobody would think that there's any need to account for anything spooky or mysterious when we're just talking about inanimate objects, right? They can't think. But when you think of your own consciousness, the richness, the subjectivity, the unlimited potential for creativity and imagination, it strikes most, or many people anyway, that that's something that cannot ultimately be reduced to the physical. So he next wants to try and give arguments that this is true, that physicalism is true. So now he's, giving us the idea of supervenience simply to express what it means to say that everything's physical. Now he wants to launch into two arguments to try and give an answer to the truth question. Is it true that everything is physical? His claim is yes, but he wants to try and convince people of that position through argumentation. So we're now going to review two arguments that Stoljar gives to try and promote the idea that physicalism is true. Okay. So the first of these two arguments he calls the argument from causal closure. And just want to make sure that we're all clear about this word. It's the word causal. A common misspelling that I see sometimes coming back in student work is that it is spelled casual, but it's not. This is a different word. Causal has to do with cause and effect, and the spelling is C-A-U-S-A-L. Casual has nothing to do with cause and effect. It's like instead of wearing formal attire, you're wearing, flip-flops and shorts. That's casual. That's C-A-S-U-A-L. But this is not the word casual, so let's make sure not to be confused. Argument from causal closure, because it's all about cause and effect, this argument. Yes, see, I knew that that would happen, William, so just to ward you off of any misunderstandings. Argument from causal closure. Okay, now this argument has got three premises, which then imply the conclusion. So we have to, walk through each premise, understand them in order. So here's the first premise of the argument. What it says is, Every event which has a cause has a physical cause. Premise one. So that's premise one. Let me just explain a little. All that it's saying is that everything that has some cause has a physical cause. Because we're living in a physical universe, so if something happens, if some effect occurs, the cause of that effect has to be a physical thing in order to be the cause. Let me just give you a random example. Suppose that a car was parked somewhere, and like a tree branch fell on that car and caused a dent in the hood. Okay, so that's the effect. But what's the cause? Well, I mean, it's a set of factors, but basically the weakening of the branch gradually over time, perhaps by passing winds, maybe little birds perching on it, caused it to become brittle. And let's say a passing gust of wind finally was sufficient to sever it from its branch. Now its mass, wind currents, and its angle and trajectory cause it to fall in the path toward the car. Then the angle that it strikes it and the mass that it has, leads to the effect of the indent in the car. And that's an entirely physical description of cause and effect, starting from the bow to the result that happens later. And it's not just this one isolated example that I'm just kind of making up. It's everything that ever happens in the universe. If a plant grows, it's the exposure to the sunlight physically, plus the moisture and so forth that leads to the production of its plant life. If anything happens in this universe, it can be traced back to a physical cause. Okay. Now, the second premise is interesting. The second premise says that mental events can cause physical events. All right, so what that second premise is basically saying is that your mind, by thinking, can cause your observable behavior that we can then, see. For example, let's go with the case of Abraham Lincoln's assassination. So this is a sad, of course, historical event, but anyways, we all know he was shot at the theater by John Wilkes Booth. So that's the effect. Lincoln died. What was the cause? Well, let's take the story from the fact of his death gradually back to the ultimate cause, what originated that effect. So we can say immediately the cause of his death was the bullet that struck his head or whatever, right, or his chest. I'm not sure where he was shot, but basically the incoming bullet caused wounds that he succumbed to, right? So the force of the projectile emitted from the firearm is the immediate cause of the death. But if we ask ourselves, well, what's the cause of the bullet striking him? Then we would say, okay, well, all right, if you hear that, it's because there's workers outside that are like water blasting the pavement. So sorry, but hopefully I'm audible. I'll bring you in a little closer. Why then did the bullet strike him? What's the cause of that? Well, because it was ejected from the firing mechanism of the firearm because of the depression of the trigger, right? And if you ask yourself, well, why was the trigger pulled, or why was the trigger pressured? Well, it's because there was a contraction of hand muscles directed from signals sent by the brain to the hand. But now we're getting to the very first step in the whole process. What caused the signal from the brain to the hand to depress the trigger? What's the cause of that event? Right, so he died from the bullet. Bullet came out from the gun. Why? Because of pressure applied to the trigger. Why did that happen? Well, because of a contraction of the hand muscle. But why did the contraction of the hand muscle occur? What was the cause of that effect? What do you think? What's the cause of that? Why did this person's hand contract around the trigger? What caused that to happen? Don't wait for somebody else. I know you're thinking of the answer, so just tell me. I don't think this is the hardest question I've asked you in this crazy semester of philosophy, right? So let me know. Why did this person's hand, John Wilkes Booth, why did it squeeze the trigger? What caused that finger to squeeze that trigger? Yes, because of his decision, right? Because his thought process, because he wanted to do that. So William, I'll get back to you on your typing issues there, but it's fine. Yes, Caesar, it's because of Booth's decision, right? So he made a mental decision that, you know, he wanted to assassinate the president. That leads to the behavior that is exhibited by his body and the overt act and the terrible consequence that resulted from it. Now, I just gave you an interesting, you know, historical example, but it doesn't need to be, of course, result from that kind of history. Any example at all. So like, for example, right now, I'm going to snap my fingers as an illustration of the process of thinking of something and then it happening with the body. So fingers were snapped. Why did that happen, though? Why did my fingers or hands perform that action? Well, because I thought in my mind, let me consider an action which I can tell them in advance that I will intend to do, and then by performing it, they'll see a clear illustration of the concept that thought in the mind can lead to behavior by the body. And that's just the life of being a living organism. So anything you're doing, whether it's playing an instrument, playing a sport, talking to somebody, typing, you know, all those behaviors that are then exhibited in the external reality are caused by a thought that a person has to do those things. Like I'm talking to you right now, and that's a physical event happening. My mouth is opening, the sound is coming out from my lungs and so forth through my throat to you. But why am I talking? Why is that event happening? Because my mind has the intent and the will to deliver the lecture to you. So basically, number 2 is just saying that mental events can cause physical events. Usually when I teach this subject, we're all in the classroom, you know, and then I can call on a student when I ask a question or when they ask a question. And oftentimes when we're in that in-class setting, I'll use that as an example too, and I'll say to a student, so why did you just raise your hand? And then they'll say, oh, because I wanted to ask you a question, or I wanted to answer your question. So that's just another vivid example, right, of thinking in the mind, mentally, and then a behavior resulting from the thought, okay? So if I think right now, you know what, clap your hands, then I do it. Behavior issues from the initial mental events. Okay, so we've got 2 premises here. First of all, every event that has one cause, that has a cause, has a physical cause. Second premise, the mind, by thinking, can bring about behavior that is a physical action. Okay, now, the third premise. This third premise is key to the argument. It's the premise of the argument that is the most, I would say, a little complicated, but in the end, even though it looks complex, I don't think it's saying anything that's so difficult to understand. So I'm going to write it up here, and then we'll go over it. So the third premise of the argument goes like this. If an event A causes an event B, then in that case, there is no other event C which is different from A and which also causes B. And I know it's a little low on the board, so I'm going to type that in the chat as well so everyone knows what it says, but let me just finish writing it. If event A causes an event B, then there is no other event C which is different from A and which also causes B. Okay, so if event A causes event B, then there is no other event C different from A and which also causes B. So I'm going to write that here and then explanation to follow. But I'm getting a little closer to the computer monitor because I'm typing in there. So okay. So you see it there in the chat, also written on the board in that tight space that you have there. So, okay, premise 3. I know it may look a little bit confusing at a first glance, but here's really what it's saying in the end, and it's not too strange. It's just saying that if something causes something else, so if A caused B, all that it says is that that means A is the only cause of B. So it's not like there's a different thing from A, which also is the cause of B. It's just A. So if A is the cause of B, that's it. It's only A. It's not both A and also something else. So perhaps simply stated, let's see if you can put this together. Premise 3 is just saying this in other words. It's saying that for every effect, there are how many causes? Can you tell me? Premise 3 is just saying that each effect has exactly how many causes? How many causes are there for each effect based on premise 3? What do you think? It's a number. It's a specific number. Exactly. It is 1. 1 cause for each effect, but only 1. Exactly 1. Not 0, and not a number greater than 1. So all that that's saying is that if A is the cause of B, it's the only cause of B. There's nothing else, like for example, C, which is also a cause of that thing. So you guys are correct. It's just saying that there's only 1 cause for each effect. Premise 3 is sometimes known as, in the essay he wrote, he calls it the exclusion principle, because what it's saying is that when something's the cause of something else, that excludes anything else from also being the cause. So each effect just has the 1 cause. Okay, so now, if we put these 3 premises together, we have a conclusion, which basically is the conclusion that mental events are physical events. So let me write this conclusion out, and then I'll explain how the premises lead to it. Now, in your own notes, you know how arguments are written out in logic and philosophy. The conclusion should visually appear at the bottom, but since I've obviously used up all my board space, I'm going to draw an arrow up here and put it above. But in your notes, it would be better for you to have it at the bottom because that shows that it's the result from the premises. But working with my materials that I have, here's the conclusion. So it just says, therefore, mental events are physical events. Okay, so let's see exactly how this follows from the premises. So from premise 1, every event in this world has a physical cause. Every event that has a cause has a physical cause. From premise 2, your mind can be the cause of physical behavior. But if every event that has a cause has a physical cause, and your mind acts as a cause of your behavior, then your mind, which causes your behavior, must itself be something physical, basically the brain. Now, what premise 3 is basically saying then is, since your brain is already a physical explanation of your behavior, it's the only explanation of your behavior. It's not that it is both the physical brain, but also separate from that, an immaterial soul or spirit, or as a philosopher might call it, mind. So what premise 3 is basically saying is the brain, which is already clearly involved in causing your bodily behavior, is the only available cause to explain that. To say that it's both the brain which causes it, which is known, but also a mysterious, non-physical mind, which acts as a secondary cause. That would be to multiply causes beyond what is necessary to explain the effect. We know your brain is responsible for causing your behavior bodily and physically. All the premise 3 is saying is there's nothing else that causes it. Because in general, in reality, events have one cause, not more than one. So to say that you've got a brain which causes your behavior is enough to explain the behavior and the physical actions. To say it's something also that's separate from the physical brain would be to add a second cause, which is superfluous and unnecessary. So that's the argument, right? Every event that has a cause has a physical cause. Your mind can cause you to do stuff, like if I clap my hands just by thinking. But because there's the physical brain, which acts as the mental cause, and because there's no other need for a second cause, and maybe even no possibility for a second cause, it's therefore true that the mental action is itself a brain action, which is a physical thing. Now, that conclusion that mental events are physical events is concluding that physicalism is true. Because if even your mind, thinking and so forth, is just physical, then everything's physical, because that's the only thing that even stands as a candidate for being non-physical. Nobody thinks there's anything else in the universe that's non-physical except for mind and consciousness. So if the activity of the mind is just physical activity, then everything's physical. Okay, so that's one argument towards the claim that physicalism is true. Remember, the truth question is the question, is physicalism true? So supervenience allows us to understand what that claim means, that physicalism is saying, and this argument is one that helps us try and, at least he thinks, persuade that physicalism is true. Now here's a second argument that he adds after that, which is a little bit shorter, and it's a little bit more straightforward, but to me it's not as interesting, but it's a second way to try and make the case that physicalism is true. So the second argument is just called argument from methodological naturalism. Okay, so it's a simple argument. It just has two premises. The first premise says that it is reasonable to believe what is believed by the methods of natural science. Okay, first premise, it's reasonable to believe what's believed by the methods of natural science. The second premise just says that physicalism is believed by the methods of natural science. So, conclusion, therefore, it is reasonable to believe physicalism. Okay, so just examining this argument one time quickly, it's pretty basic. It's the first premise is just saying it's reasonable to believe whatever the scientific consensus is. And, that's a hard premise to dispute, because even if you don't always agree with every scientific conclusion or claim, you can't really say that the people who make these claims are just being unreasonable and just being wild or something. Like, science as a field is based essentially on giving testable explanations for observed phenomena. So as a scientist, you don't just throw out a theory and say, who knows, maybe it's true, maybe it's not, I've got no evidence. You actually have to be able to provide evidence that's substantial enough that it could be tested and experimented to be confirmed and replicated by other scientists. So science in and of itself is based on the presentation of empirical evidence and data to justify some hypothesis or theory. So it's not really easy to say that they're unreasonable claims, what scientists say. That's all the first premise is saying. If you go with science, basically, you're going to be considered reasonable because scientists are reasonable. And then the second premise just adds that, by the way, physicalism is assumed to be true by the methods of science. So that's like a 1-2 combination that leads to the conclusion. If it's reasonable to believe whatever scientists do, and they basically believe in physicalism, then I guess that means, therefore, it's reasonable for you to also believe physicalism. Why, again? Because scientists believe it, and because what they believe is reasonable for you to believe. So since they believe it, you are being reasonable if you think so too. The only thing about this argument, though, in my view, and this is just maybe my opinion, but I don't find it to be as intellectually stimulating as the one we just talked about, because it kind of outsources, if you will, that intellectual labor to presumed, smart scientists and so on. And, it's not really that that's unfair. You do actually have to defer to the greater expertise that some people have in fields which you couldn't have taken the course of study in, right? So we have to defer to the counsels of doctors, geneticists, scientists, experts, astronomers, physicists. We can't necessarily do all those things just by ourselves. And a lot of times when there are people that have greater training and knowledge, we listen to them and take their view as being, established and reasonable. But in general, though, if you just say, well, it's reasonable to believe it because they believe it, then it's not as satisfying as if you are given an independent reason to think that it's true. At least in the argument from Causal Closure, you have a semblance of some reason that you yourself can consider. Like, every effect just has one cause. And, every event has a physical cause, so your brain is the only real cause of your behavior. That, I think, gives you something to chew on and consider for yourself. But this just says, there's kind of like these scientists, they're like a black box over there. They've got reasonable conclusions. Who knows how they get to them? But just follow their lead and you'll be reasonable too. I'm not saying that that's wrong or incorrect, but I always think it's a little bit more intellectually satisfying when you yourself are treated to the reason that something is claimed to be true. But anyway, here are two different, dual approaches to making the case for physicalism. On the one hand, causal closure. Everything's got a physical cause. Even your mind, which causes your behavior, is physical. And that's the only cause, and there can't be something separate to it. And then there's this argument which says that just basically follow the lead of scientists because they're reasonable and they basically assume physicalism. When I think about, and we're closing right now, so I'll just let you guys go in a second, but when I think about the first argument, sometimes I hear people give an objection that can't there be multiple causes for one effect? So say, you exist, so that's an effect. What's the cause? Isn't it both of your parents the cause? I think that basically a guy like Stoljar would say, well, in a way, the joint conception of you by the two parents is still one event. And, I've heard other examples too, like say there's a firing squad that all fires on one person in an execution, and each of their bullets struck them in a fatal location. So who's the cause of death? It's tempting to say that it's multiple individuals in the firing squad, so it's not just one cause. But in that case, the cause is kind of overdetermined by the different people. And you can see the whole firing squad itself as one jointly functioning cause. So I'm just kind of giving you a sense of where some possible objections and replies lie concerning the causal closure argument. But we're done now with Stoljar, all right? So I'm going to let you guys go. Next Wednesday, or not next, well, this Wednesday, 2 days from now, we'll be looking at the work of J.J.C. Smart, and then on Friday, we'll cover Alan Turing, and then we'll just continue going through our lecture series. So make sure you read J.J.C. Smart's paper for Wednesday, and then Turing for Friday, and we'll continue on this topic for the rest of this week. Then we'll move into one of our last topic next week, okay? So guys, thanks again so much for being here and participating. I really appreciate it. Now, have a great day, and take care, and I'll definitely see you guys back on Wednesday, okay? Thank you. Bye.